It's early January 2026. We're in the fourth year of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Today we'll look again at the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke and you are watching the BILD Situation Room. And even in the new year, we'll begin with the situation in the still contested Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk in the east. There, the Russians had already declared they held full control of the city more than a month ago. However, recent footage shows that fighting in the north and suburbs continues, and the Russian occupiers in Pokrovsk are also themselves in mortal danger right now. You have to put it that way. We're viewing new footage from the 155th Brigade, which is actively carrying out attacks on the Russians in Pokrovsk. We can see the emptied out districts and residential buildings of Pokrovsk. You can see there are practically no civilians left, but Russian soldiers everywhere who've now quartered themselves in those houses, actively taking up defensive positions, if you will. They've driven up in vehicles, as you can see, pulled up to the residential buildings destroyed by fire or at least gutted, and are now trying to set up logistics chains there. So from Pokrovsk they can move on to attack the suburbs, once to the west naturally toward Hryshin, but also to the north toward Rodynske. We'll check that situation shortly, but you can see the Russians are living dangerously here in Pokrovsk. Again and again it's kamikaze drones from the 155th Brigade attacking the individual soldiers moving through the streets. You can see that pretty clearly here at the end. Some Russians are better equipped than others. This guy, for example, is wearing winter camo, which you'd pretty much expect given the cold, snowy weather around him and the freezing conditions there. But this Russian soldier also gets hit now by the Ukrainian drone, which relentlessly pursues him through these urban canyons, through these ruined streets, and in the end strikes him down. All of this tells us that the situation for the Russians in Pokrovsk remains difficult, even though they still hold control over the vast majority of the city. But we now also have footage from the outskirts, and we can see that the Russians are trying from Pokrovsk to continue their advance. As I said, first we'll take a look at footage from Hryshin. Here we also have footage of the 155th, if I'm not mistaken. Right, this one shows the Russian army trying to push further, but once again they've made that same costly tactical error, that they clearly and completely misjudged the situation. You can clearly see these ATVs right here, actually. The tactical unarmored vehicles of the Russian army, which they try to use to push forward northwest from here. We can also see Russian soldiers who've dismounted standing by their vehicles. And that whole setup then, unsurprisingly, makes for pretty easy pickings for Ukrainian drones. Because you can see here that the kamikaze drones are flying straight at those vehicles. Some, as we've seen, aren't even that special, just LADAs with the doors removed. And so now we see the panic among the Russian soldiers. Some are tripping, and mistakes happen almost automatically. Here we see it again. One of those bukankas, basically an unarmored bus where they've even cut the back open so you can get out faster. But all those vehicles are pretty easy for the Ukrainians to attack, which is how they manage to keep up the persistent, sustained pressure on the Russian not only in Pokrovsk, but also to keep defending Hryshin a bit further northwest. And first we'll take a look at the map to get a clearer and more detailed sense of the situation here at the start of 2026. We still have, as I said, most of Pokrovsk, about 80%, under Russian control at the present moment. Those are the parts marked in red here, but at the same time we have these orange shaded areas right here quite nearby. The orange areas have a Russian presence. Russian soldiers are there occasionally, but there are also Ukrainians there who are fighting back. And at first we saw the Ukrainians' attacks here in the center of the city. So these drone attacks were aimed at the houses that were seized or occupied by the Russians. And at the same time, right after that, we saw the attacks on that street. The Russians had attempted to push into Hryshin itself or toward it. But they've tried that for over a month. They've already entered the town or the suburb several times, but each time they were either completely wiped out there or pushed back by the Ukrainians, and they pulled back. They keep trying to push forward with new convoys and columns, but the whole thing, as we can see, usually ends in disaster. We're going to head a bit further north and take a look at the situation here in Rodynske. In Rodynske, which used to have over 10,000 residents, it's also a fairly compact town with larger buildings. And here we have a situation where the Russians have already repeatedly declared they have complete control. We've seen Russian flags there, but we also keep seeing the Ukrainians come back repeatedly. That it remains a frontline town where the Russians don't simply manage to seize it, and as you can see in the following footage, the Ukrainians are repeatedly able to drive out, kill, wound, or take prisoners of war there, and even hoist their flags once more over all parts of Rodinske again, proudly reclaiming the whole town. Let's take a look now. So here we see the new footage from Rodinske, and this is footage from the first Azov Corps that was released, which shows us these archive shots of the Russian soldiers, suggesting they are everywhere in the city and all over the place to wave their flag. But now we're going to watch the latest footage from the past few days right here on screen, so just take a look. And here, suddenly in the ruins, we see Rodynske has been really battered. I mean, it's changed hands, the defenders, holders, several times over the past few weeks. We see Ukrainian flags everywhere here, waving in many places. They're being waved. So the battle for Rodynske still isn't over. The Russians haven't taken it completely, despite claiming they have several times. Instead, what we have here is geolocated footage of the Ukrainian army from various units of the Azov Corps, who are responsible for the defense here, clearly show that in every neighborhood, at not just the west, as we saw on the map, but also in the southeast, where the Russians made that first incursion, I think in October, into the city, and that Ukrainian flags are flying there again, so they've pretty much driven the Russian army out of all parts. That doesn't mean it's over, important to note. Here you can see the city's total destruction, every roof destroyed until the house no longer exists, how the church in the middle is smashed, how every home was destroyed. All of this shows us that the battle for Rodynske is still going on. The Ukrainians here aren't giving up, and the Russians don't actually have that overwhelming force they claim to have. They claim to control the major cities fully. The truth is that the fighting is still going on in all of these towns, and Ukraine has not given up in these small towns either, let alone the bigger cities, not by any stretch at all. Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, which Russia once handed over voluntarily as part of this so-called peace deal, so these cities are currently not in any danger at all to be overrun by the Russians. And what do the Russians do when they can't conquer something? We already touched on that a moment ago. They just destroy it. They bomb it down to the foundations. We're heading a bit further to Kostyantynivka, another former town of about 65,000 people, only a few kilometers away. Here too you can see the situation. The town remains largely about 90% under Ukrainian control, but that's the situation there. Once more, not a single Russian soldier has ever actually set foot here, not even for a moment. And still you can see the complete destruction of the residential neighborhoods. The city's been completely emptied out. In 2023, the city was still extremely densely populated. Not just locals lived there, but many refugees from other parts of the Donbas as well, indeed at that time. Now this is the situation here. You just can't live there anymore. And all of those 10 or 12-story buildings, even the school here in the middle, for example, completely destroyed by the Russian army, which just hasn't managed to finish the job yet for whatever reason. To actually go into Rodinske itself and occupy that town, the Russians are using their fiber optic drones to push further into Constantinivka, or at least to thin out the Ukrainians there and try to seize tactical control of nearby sectors. We're looking at the footage. These are also shots from a different, obviously as you can clearly see, a different neighborhood of Constantinivka. So not the high-rises, but those dacha neighborhoods. And here you can see Ukrainian vehicles being targeted by Russian drones that are attacking here. You'd have to say it's all fairly systematic. The Russians already hold a kind of dominance over the first 20 kilometers, just as the Ukrainians do with their own drone superiority over the enemy's vehicles and logistics. And so we keep seeing these attacks here and Ukraine's repeated attempts to set up these kinds of networks. Here we see it on both sides. They have, at least partly failed because they also started too late here in Kostyantynivka. The Russians were only approximately 5 kilometers away. At that point, you couldn't guarantee full coverage. And accordingly, what you can see here really is a patchwork. There are these nets hanging across the street. Where the Russian drone comes in, there aren't any. And accordingly, the Ukrainians in the vehicles, mostly civilian vehicles, by the way, hardly have any armored vehicles left. They've got almost no chance other than running off in every direction and trying to shoot back. But in the end, it's pretty hard to fight back against these fiber optic drones. Let's also take a look at the map to see how things look in Kostyantynivka. And like I said, that's another town in the Donbas that the Russians would first have to capture. You can see it again here before the big cities would even be up next on their list for any meaningful push forward. Here's Sloviansk, and still completely without any Russian presence. Kramatorsk likewise. And Družkivka, a small town, is also one of those so-called fortress belt towns. There too still no Russians nearby, but Kostyantynivka has been under direct attack by the Russians for many months now, although they still haven't managed to break decisively into the town to get in, and in doing so, use the situation or the terror tactics we just showed. On the one hand, the constant drone strikes on the city, and on the other, the bombing of the large residential neighborhoods there in the city, which by now are totally empty and strewn with rubble and eerie silence. And that means we've seen it. The Russian army has here down on the left, where we were earlier, in Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, at least reached part of its objectives and secured some limited tactical gains there. Without fully controlling the towns, In Kostyantynivka, it's still pushing forward. That means this scenario the Russians painted and that will have taken the whole Donbas in a few months, that still holds, at least for now, as of today, actually. Fairly unlikely, especially since, as we can see, the weather is really pretty bad right now. If the Russians try to advance mechanized, covering several kilometers a day, then most of their vehicles and soldiers will very likely be taken out in the process. Getting destroyed or killed in the process. From Donetsk, we want to push further south into Ukraine, into the Zaporizhzhia region. There, the Russian army has scored yet another notable success. At least for a time, it managed to seize and maintain full control of the small town of Huljajpole and hold it firmly for a period. But that came at an extremely high price, not just for the Russians, but for Ukrainian infrastructure as well. Let's take a look at the so-called victory video of the Russian army to see how. This victory, this Pyrrhic victory over Huljajpole, was achieved, namely by utterly and completely destroying the town's infrastructure. Let's just let it play. These are all rosy shots that show us how, on the one hand, here we see the Su-34 taking off with FAB 500 bombs or even heavier ones. It completely destroyed this town, leaving it in complete ruins. How they utterly flattened every single building where they suspected there might be Ukrainians inside. So the whole thing is, again, a hollow victory. You can see it clearly right here. These are the large residential neighborhoods in the city center with 6- or 7-story apartment buildings and regularly occurring massive explosions. That led to the Russians being able to enter the city and destroy it even more, ultimately making it impossible to live there. We can also see now that not only FAB bombs were used, but TOS-1A thermobaric weapons were used too, meaning especially powerful, devastating explosions caused by that chemical mixture and its shockwave, which is what causes the explosions here. On impact, you can see it here, it's glinting again now, you can make it out pretty clearly. So really these extremely blinding explosions, which also, at least it feels, kind of happen a bit faster, yeah? I mean, they basically swell up quicker than the FAB explosions because of that chemical mix, what basically gets ignited on impact. All in all, it caused the Ukrainians there to be very weakened, to the point that in the end they were utterly and completely overrun. The 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade was involved in a big scandal around Christmas where they'd abandoned the headquarters and the Russians went in there. They'd taken over all the communication software and hardware and many others, who unfortunately also managed to obtain information about the defense. We can now see here the Russian propaganda videos of the 38th Separate brigade that's just raised the flags here, but even here it's still not clear whether the Russians actually control the city. It's not confirmed yet, and independent on-site verification is lacking. There are new videos showing that some Ukrainian commando teams are also operating in the eastern part of the city. All in all, again, the dynamic is more that the Russians are consolidating things here because they basically, at least for a time, had entered the city completely and all the districts, as you can see from these flags, for the moment and on the ground, that we had taken under control here. But even there, it's not like after the fall of Huljajpole, the Russians are now pushing quickly further west into Zaporizhzhia, but rather that it actually looks like these clashes inside the city are just going to continue here for the time being a while longer. And the Russians, who now give the impression they've got everything under control, are still in big trouble there, especially when it comes to Ukrainian counterattacks, above all with drones. Let's take a look at the situation there. How things are in Huljajpole right now on the 5th. What it looks like on January 5th, 2026, and you can also see that our map provider, Deep State Map, has part of the town completely under Russian control. Those are the red areas. And there's this orange area. The town area is roughly here. The orange zone has expanded to cover almost the entire town. That means we already assume Russians are everywhere, that they were even able to raise their flag, but that the Ukrainians, for example, keep on launching counterattacks from Zalisnichne repeatedly. We'd also seen over the last few days that the Russians had attacked Zalisnichne with lots of bombs, with many FAB bombs. That means there's still resistance in the region. And after the fall of Huljajpole, it's not like the front here is completely collapsing, but more like it's similar to Pokrovsk at least, that the Ukrainians are trying, after a commando or a brigade couldn't hold it and had to pull back, to contain the damage here as much as possible and keep losses down as best they can. Also to keep up the pain for the Russians there in that partly, at least mostly, lost city as large as it possibly can be for as long as possible. We're staying in Zaporizhzhia because that's where most of the fighting is happening right now. We'll start off with Ukrainian videos showing how they're trying to knock out Russian air defenses behind the front here in Zaporizhzhia using a variety of tactics and weapons. And we keep seeing Ukrainian drones managing to strike these Buk and Tor systems, in this case a very modern Buk M3 that costs many millions even while it's operational and actively deployed. And we can clearly see here that the system is moving. It's even driving forward on the road. We have the raised missile launchers and we also have the radar detection system clearly in view. The Ukrainians, of course, aim where it hurts the most, at the radar system. If that's even slightly damaged, you simply can't fire missiles at aircraft, helicopters, or similar aerial targets anymore. So the Ukrainians here keep actively destroying these Buk anti-air systems. And we also see yet another strike right here in the Zaporizhzhia region, this time targeting a Tor system of the Russian army. It doesn't cost quite as much as what we just saw, but the Russians still actively use it to protect their airspace. But you can see pretty clearly that against drones, you're pretty helpless here. Even though the radar up here is rotating, it's either that the systems are completely blind to the drones or they simply don't detect them, so they don't see them at all. Or, and we've seen that over and over in past videos, if you do spot them, you fire at them, but the missiles, they just fly past because these drones are simply too small for them. The seeker head doesn't react in the moment and the missile's detonation doesn't get triggered. But the Russians remain very active in Zaporizhzhia. Another video shows that even the city of Zaporizhzhia, with 700,000 inhabitants, that it's being increasingly threatened by the Russian army, and now drones are being used there, the kind you usually only see up close at the front. But that just shows us that Zaporizhzhia has sadly been pushed right up near the front by the Russian advance. We're looking at a video from the city itself, and what we're about to see fly by here, I hope you can make it out. There it is, quite clear to see. This is a Lancet drone of the Russian army with roughly a 50-kilometer range, and this drone is now, for reasons unclear to us, heading straight for a civilian transport truck right now. That was just standing there, a loaded truck. Maybe the Russians assumed it could be carrying tank traps or similar items. I mean, you can't really know for sure, though. You see women and children nearby, so this is a residential area attacked. The truck is right beside it and burning, and the family is trying to get away. Here are a few more shots that show it. The truck was parked in the lot in front of a high-rise housing complex, was attacked here, and the map shows it. You can see this clearly on the live screen right now. How close the front has come to Zaporizhzhia. The footage we just saw, as I said, comes from the city. And interestingly, not from the eastern part, but indeed from the city's western side itself, as you can clearly see in those shots. But from the west bank, from this area of the city here. And if we look at the whole picture, we see that, for example, to Vasilivka. You can see it up here at about 16 kilometers. What it's showing is that there's still roughly 37 to 38 kilometers between, relatively secure fixed Russian drone positions on the ground, as marked on the map right now. Even in Kamyansky, the Russians can now station drones. You can see it, red, dark red, so firmly under Russian control, and well, a Zaporizhzhian town. That means we can also have Lancet attacks, Lancet with a range of up to 70 kilometers. That we encounter them in the city, affecting the civilians there, or at least people nearby. That, of course, makes it even more dangerous for the people in the city of Zaporizhzhia, a large city of 700,000 inhabitants, because even though the front is still, as we can see here, about 25 kilometers south of the city, we still have the situation that the Russians can already reach into it with many weapon systems. Finally, let's take a look at the Ukrainian Air Force's efforts to defend its airspace against looming Russian threats. There we have some striking footage showing how F-16 jets are being used against Shahed drones. Here we see cockpit footage from those F-16s. Ukraine, according to different reports, has already received somewhere between 20 and 50 of them from various Western countries. They're armed with fairly modern Sidewinder AM-9 missiles, and here they're being used from the airspace up above, so to speak, or simply from the air. Of course, they're air-to-air missiles, and they're being guided directly at the Russian drones. We can now see the missiles contrail, and right up front we just saw the explosion where a Shahed 136 drone of the Russian army is blown out of the sky, disintegrating in a bright, fiery flash, scattering burning debris. The pilot's always kind of trying to keep up. Sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't. Now we see it again up front here. I hope you can make it out. That there was a big explosion up in the sky there, because that's what that air-to-air missile hit, and at the end you can see it again pretty clearly. So that's yet another Russian drone shot down, and as we know, the Russians attack with an average of roughly 120 Shahed terror drones every single day. Some days it's fewer, some days it's up to 800. And then at the end we see that big explosion down here in the sky. I hope you can make them out. Big explosion in the sky. That means every one of these rockets, which are pretty expensive, you've got to say, of course saves lives and also saves infrastructure in Ukraine, because they shoot those 4.4 meter, 4.7 meter long Russian Shahed drones out of the sky before they can reach their respective targets in Ukraine.